What happens when a cop laughs at a black woman's ID at the airport, thinking it's a joke? Well, it turns out he doesn't realize who he's dealing with. Seconds later, the situation turns completely, and the very man who mocked her ends up having to apologize because his boss rushes to do what he should have done in the first place. You won't believe how this unexpected twist unfolds. Before we dive in, tell us, where are you watching from? Aisha had just stepped off her flight, exhausted but relieved. She had spent the last few hours in the air, heading home after a long trip, and now she was at the final checkpoint, airport security. She'd done this countless times before, so nothing about it felt unusual, or so she thought. As she approached the security officer, a middle-aged man with a tired look, she handed over her ID, ready for the usual routine. But as soon as the officer glanced at it, his face twisted into an incredulous grin. He looked up at her, clearly amused. "Is this real?" he asked, laughing as if she had just told him the funniest joke in the world. Aisha froze for a moment. She had heard this before. People laughing at her, underestimating her, assuming she was just another person they could dismiss. But this time, something in her shifted. She didn't let his words sting. Instead, she stared back at him, calm and composed, not giving him the reaction he was expecting. She knew all too well that some people got a thrill out of putting others down, but she wasn't going to be part of that game. The officer expected her to smile awkwardly, maybe even apologize for his behavior. What he didn't expect was for her to simply stand there, unshaken, and wait. The moment his boss walked up, things were about to take an unexpected turn. Aisha stood there, not sure what to think. The security officer was still holding her ID in his hand, a smug smile on his face. She had just walked up to him, thinking this was going to be just another quick stop through airport security. She'd handed him her ID, as she always did, expecting the usual. "Thank you, ma'am," and then on to the next part of her journey. But instead, he was laughing. His laughter rang out across the busy security checkpoint, drawing a few curious glances. It wasn't a friendly laugh either. It was dismissive, as if he couldn't believe someone like her was holding such an ID. Aisha's grip on her luggage tightened. She could feel the familiar rush of anger bubbling up. She had dealt with her share of racism and microaggressions over the years, but it never got easier. The assumptions, the judgments, the way people thought they could belittle her with just a look or a laugh. She had faced it her whole life, but that didn't mean it didn't sting. The officer cleared his throat and then looked at her ID again, still smiling. "I didn't expect this," he said, shaking his head. "Are you sure this is real? You don't look like you'd have an ID like this." Aisha stood completely still, her expression unreadable. She didn't say anything at first. She didn't feel the need to respond with anger or a sharp remark. She had learned over the years that sometimes silence was the loudest answer. But her mind was racing. Was this how people saw her? Did he think she didn't belong in certain spaces, that she didn't have the right to be here? His words hung in the air, mocking and unspoken. She could feel the eyes of those around her flickering over, wondering why the officer was laughing. They were waiting for her to react, for her to get upset or walk away in embarrassment. They wanted her to shrink into herself, to just let this moment pass. But Aisha wasn't the type to let things go. She took a deep breath, standing tall. "Is there a problem, officer?" Her voice was steady but firm. There was no hesitation, no hint of fear in her tone. She wasn't going to let him get away with it. The officer paused. His smile faltered slightly. It seemed like he didn't know how to respond to her calmness. He had probably expected her to get upset or defensive, maybe even apologize for the awkwardness he'd caused. But that wasn't going to happen. No problem," he said, quickly shifting the ID back and forth in his hands, now unsure of himself. Just had to make sure. Sometimes it's hard to tell." Aisha didn't let him off the hook. "Hard to tell what?" she asked. "Because I'm black, and my ID doesn't look like what you expect?" The officer looked uncomfortable now, his smile completely gone. But before he could stammer out another excuse, someone stepped up behind him. Aisha didn't see the man at first, but she heard his voice loud and clear. "Officer, what's going on here?" The voice wasn't angry, but it carried a weight that immediately commanded attention. It was strong but authoritative. Aisha turned slightly to see a man in a suit approaching. He had a serious expression. And the way he looked at the officer made it clear that whatever had been going on was about to be addressed. The officer stiffened, his earlier arrogance now replaced with a look of discomfort. Uh, just checking some IDs, he muttered, avoiding eye contact with the man. The man, who was clearly the officer's superior, looked at Aisha with a quick glance of recognition. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry for the inconvenience. It seems there's been some misunderstanding here." Aisha's heart beat a little faster, but she remained calm. She wasn't looking for an apology from this officer, not really. What she needed to see was that her dignity was respected. And this wasn't just about him, it was about making sure everyone knew that this behavior was unacceptable. The officer's superior turned to him and then back to Aisha. "I want to make this right. This situation should never have happened. Officer, you need to apologize." The officer stood frozen, his face flushing with embarrassment. He couldn't even look Aisha in the eye as he mumbled, "Sorry, ma'am." Aisha didn't accept his apology right away. She didn't have to. It wasn't just about a few words. It was about the disrespect, the assumption, and the judgment that had been made based on her appearance. The man who had stepped in cleared his throat, his gaze still locked onto the officer. "And don't let this happen again. I'll be making sure this issue is reviewed and addressed." His tone left no room for argument. It was clear that he wasn't going to tolerate the behavior of the officer any longer. Aisha finally met the officer's eyes. "It's not enough just to say sorry," she said. "It's about making sure you understand why this is wrong and why it matters. And maybe, just maybe, you should rethink your assumptions next time." The officer nodded stiffly, but it was clear that his pride had taken a hit. For the first time, he seemed to realize that his actions weren't just unprofessional, they were harmful. As Aisha picked up her bags and walked away, she felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. Not because she had won some huge battle, but because she had stood up for herself. She had confronted a situation that many people would have let slide, and in doing so, she had sent a clear message. This kind of treatment wasn't acceptable anymore. Her steps were slow, deliberate, and calm. But in the back of her mind, she knew the world was starting to change. More and more people were standing up, speaking out, and demanding better. And this time, she had been a part of that shift. Her silence hadn't been weakness. It had been strength, and she would continue to stand tall, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been disrespected, ignored, or underestimated. Because change started with one voice, and today, that voice had been hers. Aisha stood there, her gaze steady, but her heart pounding in her chest. The officer's dismissive laugh still echoed in her mind. He had assumed that because she was a black woman, she would just tolerate his mockery. But Aisha wasn't that kind of person. She had been underestimated her whole life, and this moment was no different. The difference now was that she wasn't going to let him get away with it. She could feel the weight of the situation hanging in the air. People around her, other travelers, were starting to notice. The officer, trying to regain control of the situation, shuffled uncomfortably, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Aisha's calm, unwavering presence made him look even more out of place. The fact that she hadn't immediately reacted in the way he had expected made him feel uneasy. He had tried to use his power over her, thinking it would intimidate her, but Aisha wasn't afraid of him. She had lived through too much to be afraid now. The officer cleared his throat and made another weak attempt to hand her ID back, but his discomfort was evident. "Sorry about that," he muttered, still not fully acknowledging the depth of what he had done. "Just checking everything, ma'am." Aisha didn't take the ID. She didn't let the apology slide. "Do you always laugh at people's IDs?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "Is that part of your job, or were you just having a bad day?" The officer faltered. He wasn't prepared for someone to call him out like this. His mouth opened and closed as he searched for words, but none came out. "Officer, is there a problem here?" The voice came from behind Aisha, and she turned to see the officer's boss, a tall man in a suit, walking quickly toward them. He had obviously been alerted by the growing tension and the looks of disapproval from the people around them. The officer's face drained of color as he saw his boss approaching. He straightened up, but it was clear he was nervous. Aisha could tell that whatever had just transpired had made him realize that his behavior wasn't just a minor slip-up. It was a mistake that could cost him far more than a few awkward moments. The boss looked at the officer and then at Aisha. I'm terribly sorry for the inconvenience, ma'am. I was informed about the situation here, and I assure you, this is not how we handle things. Aisha met the boss's gaze, her eyes unwavering. The apology wasn't what she had been expecting, but she appreciated the tone of sincerity that came with it. She didn't want just an apology from the officer. She wanted him to understand why his behavior was wrong and how it affected her. She had grown up in a world where people, especially authority figures, thought they could treat her as less than, simply because of the color of her skin. She wasn't going to let that continue. The officer's boss turned to him with a disappointed look. "What were you thinking?" he asked, his voice low but stern. The officer, now clearly aware of how serious the situation had become, didn't answer. Instead, he looked down, unable to meet his superior's eyes. "You need to apologize properly, and this situation needs to be handled appropriately," the boss continued. "We don't tolerate this kind of behavior, and I'll make sure it's addressed." The officer's face flushed red. It was clear that the realization of what he had done had finally hit him. He had made a careless mistake, and now he had to deal with the consequences. Isha, however, wasn't satisfied with just a quick apology. She had spent years of her life being dismissed and marginalized, and this was one of those moments where it wasn't enough to just accept words. Actions were what mattered. The officer shifted uncomfortably, his hands fidgeting with the ID he had been holding on to. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said again, this time with more hesitation. But Aisha wasn't looking for a half-hearted apology. She needed him to understand why what he did was wrong, why it mattered. She took a breath, feeling the strength of her own voice as she spoke. "You don't get to laugh at people because you think you can," she said, her tone steady but filled with conviction. "I don't care how long you've been on the job. You don't get to mock someone's ID, not because of their name or the way they look. That's not your place." The officer's boss nodded, clearly taking note of Aisha's words. "You're absolutely right," he said. "This was completely unprofessional, and I'll be making sure this doesn't happen again." Aisha felt a small sense of victory, not because the officer had apologized, but because she had made sure he understood the impact of his actions. She wasn't going to let him brush this off. He needed to learn, just like anyone who made assumptions based on race or appearance. The boss turned back to Aisha, his expression sincere. "Ma'am, again, I apologize for this situation. I'll ensure that this officer receives additional training on how to handle these situations appropriately. This behavior will not be tolerated." Isha gave a small nod. She wasn't here to make the officer's life miserable. She wasn't here to ruin his career. But she was here to make sure that when people like him treated others unfairly, they had to face the consequences. She didn't need his sympathy, but she did need him to learn that respect wasn't something to be taken lightly. The boss, recognizing the seriousness of the situation, turned to the officer again. "You're to accompany me to my office, where we'll discuss further actions. I'll also be following up with a formal report on this incident." The officer nodded silently, his face still red with embarrassment. As he followed his boss, Aisha stood there for a moment, reflecting on what had just happened. She had stood her ground, spoken her truth, and in doing so had reminded the world that respect and dignity weren't negotiable. As she finally walked away, her steps were purposeful. This wasn't just about one officer, it was about standing up to the system, making sure that people like her, like anyone who was ever treated unfairly, had a voice. And today her voice had been heard. The apology from the officer felt like a hollow gesture to Aisha. She had heard "I'm sorry" countless times before, but it rarely meant anything. She had been through enough situations where apologies were given, but no real action followed. As she walked out of the airport security line, she thought about how the officer's actions had made her feel. It wasn't about the laughter anymore. It was about the assumption, the disrespect. Her hand brushed against the cool surface of her phone in her bag, and something caught her eye. She had received an alert, an email notification from a local news outlet. The subject line was eye-catching. "Local woman calls out airport officer for racial discrimination. Apology issued." Her heart skipped. She hadn't expected her brief encounter to be newsworthy, but there it was. Aisha clicked the email, her eyes scanning the words. It was a story about what had happened at the security checkpoint, but it wasn't just a recounting of the incident. The article had a twist that made her stop reading for a moment in disbelief. Apparently, after the officer's apology, there had been an unexpected turn of events. The news article mentioned that a high-ranking official at the airport had been notified of the situation. And not just any official, but someone who had ties to the city's civil rights office. The officer's superior had not only apologized, but had gone above and beyond to ensure that Aisha's experience wasn't just acknowledged, it was going to be investigated. The article detailed that the officer's actions weren't being swept under the rug. The situation was being taken seriously, and an internal review of the officer's behavior was underway. But that wasn't the biggest revelation. The twist was that the official who had intervened wasn't just an airport boss. He was a well-known advocate for racial equality in the city. His involvement meant this wasn't going to be just a minor incident that would fade away. This was about to be much bigger than Aisha had imagined. The more she read, the more she realized that the officer's laughter, his poor judgment, had set off a chain reaction that was making waves. The airport, already under scrutiny for previous complaints about racial profiling, was now being forced to confront something it had tried to ignore. Aisha wasn't just a victim of an isolated incident. She was part of a much bigger conversation about accountability, bias, and the culture that allowed these things to happen in the first place. Aisha wasn't sure how to process it. She had dealt with her fair share of disrespect in her life, but now she was becoming part of something bigger. She had spoken up, and it seemed like the response was gaining momentum. The airport was going to be scrutinized, and the officer who had initially laughed at her was now the subject of an internal review that could cost him more than just his pride. The article mentioned something that made Aisha pause and read it over again. The officer has been placed on temporary leave pending the investigation and review of his actions. Aisha couldn't help but feel a rush of emotion. The officer wasn't just being told he was wrong, there were real consequences. The apology wasn't just a way to get her to move on. There was a significant shift in the air, and Aisha had been the catalyst for it. But even more surprising than the officer's leave was the follow-up. The article went on to say that there had been multiple complaints about similar behavior at the airport, and this incident had prompted other individuals to come forward with their own stories. It seemed that Aisha wasn't alone. The behavior she had witnessed wasn't just an isolated case. Others had faced the same kind of microaggressions and discrimination, and now they were finding the courage to speak up. Aisha thought about it for a moment. She didn't feel angry anymore. Instead, she felt empowered. What had seemed like an isolated moment of disrespect had sparked something larger. A conversation, an investigation, and perhaps even a shift in the culture at the airport. She wasn't looking for fame or recognition. She wasn't looking for anyone to pat her on the back. But she had said something. She had stood her ground, and now things were changing. The next few hours were a blur. Her phone buzzed with messages from friends and family, all congratulating her for speaking out. Some of them had seen the article already, while others were just now hearing about it. She smiled at the support, but the deeper satisfaction came from the knowledge that something real was happening. Aisha knew that one conversation wasn't going to fix everything, but it was a start. A small victory, perhaps, but a victory nonetheless. It wasn't long before Aisha received a call from the city's civil rights office, the same office that had been involved in the story that had caught her attention. The person on the other end of the line introduced themselves as a representative from the office and explained that they were reaching out to people who had been affected by this kind of behavior. Aisha was told that they would be reviewing the entire situation, not just the officer's actions, but the overall treatment of minority passengers at the airport. The revelation hit Aisha harder than she expected. This wasn't just about her standing up to the officer. It was about an entire system being forced to address its flaws. This wasn't just one officer being reprimanded. It was an opportunity to make lasting change. Aisha felt her heart race as she realized the full scope of what had happened. Her simple act of standing up for herself had turned into something much more significant than she could have imagined. Her involvement in the investigation didn't end with the article. She was contacted multiple times by both the Civil Rights Office and the airport's internal review board. They wanted her input, her perspective, and her experience. It seemed like the more she spoke, the more attention her case drew. What started as a small, personal incident was now a key part of a broader conversation about racial bias in public spaces. She was no longer just the woman at the airport who had been laughed at. She was a part of something that could lead to real changes. Aisha had learned a valuable lesson that day. Sometimes standing up for yourself wasn't just about reclaiming your dignity in the moment. It was about creating space for others, starting a dialogue, and forcing people to confront the way things had always been. She hadn't known what the outcome would be when she stood tall in front of that officer, but now she could see the impact. It was only the beginning. The days following Aisha's encounter with the officer felt surreal. As the investigation began to unfold, the reactions from the public were far beyond what she had expected. What started as a personal stand against an officer's disrespect had quickly spiraled into a citywide conversation. Aisha had never imagined that her simple act of speaking up would spark such a powerful movement. She'd been tired, frustrated, and angry in that moment at the airport, but she had acted from a place of dignity. What followed wasn't just an apology from one officer. It was a reckoning that reached far beyond the walls of the airport. The airport's internal review board began to take serious action. They had opened an investigation into the officer's behavior and the complaints about racial bias that had started to surface. Aisha found herself fielding calls, messages, and interviews from media outlets and local activists who were eager to discuss the case. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel small, laughed at, or dismissed by someone in power. It was a chance to hold the system accountable. Aisha knew this wasn't just about punishing the officer, though. The bigger picture had to be about changing the culture of bias that often went unchecked. Her story had shed light on the microaggressions that people of color face every day. Those little moments where individuals are dismissed, mocked, or treated as if they don't belong. She wasn't just going to sit back and let the incident become another statistic. She was going to push for real change. While she appreciated the support from others, Aisha also knew that it wasn't enough to simply rely on the system to make things right. It was up to everyone, people of all backgrounds, to challenge biases, to call out discrimination, and to ensure that these conversations didn't end with a single apology. The officer's apology might have been sincere, but it didn't undo the harm caused, nor did it erase the years of disrespect that people like Aisha had endured. Through all the media coverage, something became clear. Aisha wasn't the only one who had faced this kind of treatment. In fact, the more people spoke out, the more she realized how widespread the problem was. Other travelers, especially those of color, began to share their own experiences of being treated unfairly at the same airport. It wasn't just a one-off incident. It was a pattern of behavior that needed to be addressed. And the conversation wasn't just about the airport either. It was about society at large, about the way people of color were often expected to tolerate disrespect and unfair treatment. Isha felt a deep sense of responsibility now. She wasn't just advocating for herself anymore. She was advocating for everyone who had ever been in her shoes. She reached out to local organizations, attended community meetings, and even participated in a public forum where she shared her story and encouraged others to do the same. What had initially felt like a small act of personal defiance had grown into something much larger. Aisha realized that her quiet strength had created a ripple effect, and she wasn't going to stop now. The internal review at the airport continued, and there were serious consequences for the officer's behavior. Not only was he placed on temporary leave, but the airport also promised to implement diversity and bias training for all its employees. The officer's boss, who had initially stepped in to apologize on Aisha's behalf, made it clear that the airport would no longer tolerate discriminatory behavior. The investigation led to a broader examination of the airport's policies, and changes were proposed to ensure that future incidents of racial profiling would be addressed more effectively. Aisha didn't just want the officer to lose his job or for the airport to go through the motions of diversity training. She wanted systemic change. She wanted to see real consequences for the way people like her were treated on a daily basis, even in small moments. If this incident could be the catalyst for that change, then it was worth every moment she had spent reflecting on it. The community's response was overwhelmingly positive. People from all walks of life reached out to thank her for standing up and setting an example. They expressed gratitude for her courage and for making them realize that, together, they could challenge the biases that so often went unnoticed. Aisha didn't expect to become a symbol for the fight against discrimination, but she was glad to see that her story was inspiring others to stand up for themselves as well. Her simple act of speaking out had encouraged people to find their voices and challenge the status quo. In the months that followed, Aisha kept thinking about the way things had played out. She hadn't intended for this to turn into a public spectacle, but the more she thought about it, the more she understood why it had to be this way. It wasn't just about confronting one officer. It was about shining a light on the bigger issue of racial injustice that had been overlooked for too long. Her own growth through the process was also undeniable. She realized that while it had felt uncomfortable to stand up for herself in that moment at the airport, it had been the right thing to do. The truth was, people like Aisha had always been told to stay silent, to let these little moments slide by without making a scene. But sometimes silence wasn't the answer. Sometimes standing up for what's right meant being uncomfortable, even at the risk of confrontation. Aisha had discovered that her voice had power, that one person could spark change if they were willing to stand firm. Looking back, Aisha could see the impact of her actions. The airport had implemented new policies, yes, but more importantly, a conversation had been started, one that was long overdue. Aisha wasn't the only one speaking up anymore. There were more people joining her cause, more individuals coming forward to say, "I've been treated this way too." The officer's actions had set off a domino effect, one that was exposing the hidden truths behind microaggressions and racial bias. In the end, Aisha knew that this was more than just a personal victory. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been marginalized, for everyone who had been made to feel less than. It wasn't just about getting an apology. It was about forcing people to face the reality of the world we live in and demanding change. She had done something simple that day. She had stood her ground when others would have let it go. And that act of defiance had led to something much bigger than she could have imagined. Aisha had made her mark, not just in the airport, but in the hearts and minds of those who had heard her story. She had shown them that speaking up could make a difference, and that's the kind of change the world needed. Aisha's experience at the airport wasn't just about the officer's mistake. It was about the bigger picture of what happens when people stand up for themselves. She didn't just get an apology. She sparked a conversation that reached beyond the airport's walls, changing how people saw the small moments of disrespect that often go unnoticed. Her story became a reminder to everyone that it's okay to speak up, that it's okay to demand respect. What started as a single encounter grew into a broader movement for accountability. The officer's actions became a turning point, not just for him, but for the entire system. And Aisha, she wasn't just the woman who had been laughed at. She was the woman who turned that moment into something powerful. This story shows that sometimes it's not the big battles that matter most. Sometimes it's the small ones, the moments when you stand your ground, even when it feels uncomfortable, that can make the biggest difference. What about you? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to stand up against disrespect, no matter how small? What did you do? How did it feel? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. And if this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let's keep the conversation going, and together, we can keep pushing for change, one small step at a time.